The document most associated with Martin Luther and the Reformation is undoubtedly the 95 Theses. In fact, Luther himself recognized that the Theses were what made his name known to people outside of his small circle in Wittenberg. Although, in retrospect, Luther claimed not to have understood why they set off a firestorm throughout the Holy Roman Empire. It's certainly up for debate whether or not Luther was deliberate in his calculations concerning the impact his proposals would have on the papacy and on society as a whole. In order to explore this question further, the task of this episode is to look at Luther's own account of the events that unfolded in 1517. This can be found in an autobiographical fragment Luther wrote in 1545 titled Preface to the Latin Writings of 1545. Before diving into the specific details Luther laid out, there's something we can learn about Luther in his opening salutation. Now, recall, this preface was written in 1545, just months before Luther would take his last breaths. And with his opening lines, Luther's motivations and disposition are evident. Luther wrote, "Martin Luther wishes the sincere reader salvation." As you may have heard in other episodes on Luther, a vocation Luther maintained his whole life was that of a pastor. Simply put, Luther had a pastor's heart and was driven by his care of souls. These first words certainly reflect that care. Luther then acknowledged that his theology was changed from what he was taught as a young scholar and pastor to something very different. In other words, he was not born a Lutheran. Luther put it this way, quote, "May the reader be mindful of the fact that I was once a monk and a most enthusiastic papist when I began that cause. I was so drunk, yes, submerged in the Pope's dogmas, that I would have been ready to murder all, if I could have, or to cooperate willingly with the murderers of all who would take but a syllable from obedience to the Pope." End quote. Luther, in his own words, admitted he was a zealot for the papacy. He was the ultimate team player. The last thing he wanted to do was tear down the institution. He was devout and convinced that whatever came out of Rome was good. Thus, Luther continued, quote, "So, you will find how much and what important matters I humbly conceded to the Pope in my earlier writings, which I later now hold and execrate as the worst blasphemies and abomination. You will, therefore, sincere reader, ascribe this error, or, as they slander, contradiction, to the time and my inexperience." End quote. As you read further in this autobiography, you find Luther laying out his motivations for composing the 95 Theses. As a young doctor of the church, he wanted to dissuade the average person from listening and falling prey to the indulgence peddlers. He recognized the harm it inflicted on his parishioners and their consciences. Now, remember, Luther was writing his autobiography in 1545, 38 years after he posted the Theses. It is reasonable to think that Luther's memory could have been a little fuzzy after 38 years. But if you look at the 95 Theses themselves, including Luther's introduction to the Theses, you'll be able to judge for yourself the accuracy of Luther's memory. So, let's turn our attention to the 95 Theses. Luther's introduction is informative. He lays out both his credentials and his motivation for writing the 95 Theses in the very first words. Quote, "Out of love and zeal for the truth and the desire to bring it to light, the following theses will be publicly discussed at Wittenberg under the chairmanship of the Reverend Father Martin Luther, Master of Arts and Sacred Theology, and regularly appointed lecturer on these subjects at that place." End quote. Remember, as a doctor of the church, Luther had taken a vow to teach the truth. That vow gave him the authority to write and post the 95 Theses. Without those credentials, Luther would have been jailed for doing so. Additionally, Luther was concerned about those he preached to. He knew well what burdened a conscience and how it needed to be freed. Keep that in mind as we take a sampling of the theses to get at the heart of Luther's concern. Let's begin with thesis number 4. The penalty of sin remains as long as the hatred of self, that is the true inner repentance, until our entrance into the kingdom of heaven. Put it another way, Luther is saying that the penalty of sin remains until death. I've read this thesis in the classroom lectures before. Initially, some want to dispute it, but Luther knew as well as anyone what happens to a person's conscience in the throes of sin. Take, for example, if you were involved in a car accident and someone died while you were driving. No person or explanation can make you forget what happened. And whether or not you were deemed legally responsible for the death, your conscience is such that someone died and it was the car you were driving that killed them. You will carry this memory to your grave. So, listen again to Luther. The consequences of sin remain until you enter the kingdom of heaven. With that in mind, then, listen to the next couple of theses. Number 5. The Pope neither desires nor is able to remit any penalties except those imposed by his own authority or that of the canons. And number 6. The Pope cannot remit any guilt except by declaring and showing that it has been remitted by God, or, to be sure, by remitting guilt in cases reserved to his judgment. If his right to grant remission in these cases were disregarded, the guilt would certainly remain unforgiven. So, what's the significance of these two theses? In previous episodes, we talked about Luther having been taught that the Pope held the authority of the office of the keys, which is the ultimate authority to bind and loose sins. With that authority, the Pope ruled both spiritually and temporally. In the 5th and 6th theses, Luther begins to call that authority into question. He grants that the Pope can forgive sins against the laws of the institutional church, such as prohibitions found in the canon law like clerical celibacy or monastic orders. But when it comes to transgressions against God's decrees, the only power the Pope has is to repeat the absolution uttered by Christ. This is a significant shift in Luther's understanding. Moreover, the ramifications of these two theses are innumerable. Not only did removing the power of the Pope create political, social, and economic fallout, it had tremendous theological ramifications. Examples of the theological ramifications are found in the thesis addressing the concept of purgatory. Purgatory was, and still is, an understanding in Roman Catholic theology which teaches that after a person dies, if they had not yet reached spiritual perfection, they would have to stay in purgatory long enough to burn off any remaining sin. Luther criticized this understanding in Thesis 10 and 13. In Thesis 10, Luther wrote, "Those priests act ignorantly and wickedly who, in the case of the dying, reserve canonical penalties for purgatory." He continues in Thesis 13, "The dying are freed by death from all penalties, are already dead as far as the canon laws are concerned, and have a right to be released from them." This is a significant departure from the Roman Catholic theology Luther had been taught. Luther logically followed what came out of Thesis 4. Given the fact that the penalty of sin remains until death, anyone who dies is naturally freed from all penalties and is, therefore, released from the canon laws. Luther continued to run the logic in Thesis 20 when he wrote, "Therefore, the Pope, when he uses the words plenary remission of all penalties, does not actually mean all penalties, but only those imposed by himself." So, again, Luther is making the distinction between the Pope's authority over the canon laws and the Pope's authority over sin against God's decrees as found in Scripture. The Pope's authority in his own name extends only to the canon laws. With that in mind, Thesis 21 needs no explanation. Luther writes, "Thus, those indulgence preachers are in error who say that a man is absolved every penalty and saved by papal indulgences." Luther continued in that vein in Thesis 26. "The Pope does very well when he grants remission to souls in purgatory, not by the power of the keys, which he does not have, but by way of intercession for them." Now, it's important to recognize the driving force found in the first quarter of his theses. Luther was not addressing a societal, political, or economic concern. Rather, he was addressing the conscience of everyday people. What follows in the rest of the 95 Theses flows out of Luther's pastoral concerns. We can see this emerge in Thesis 27 and 28 as Luther goes after the practice of indulgence directly. In Thesis 27, he says, "They preach only human doctrines who say that as soon as the money clinks into the money chest, the soul flies out of purgatory." Luther goes on in Thesis 28 to say, "It is certain that when money clinks in the money chest, greed and avarice can be increased. But when the church intercedes, the result is in the hands of God alone." Now, recall what was said earlier. Luther's theology developed over time, and he wasn't born a Lutheran, so to speak. This is especially evident in Thesis 42. That thesis says Christians are to be taught that the Pope does not intend that the buying of indulgences should in any way be compared with the works of mercy. What Luther is saying here is that the works of mercy, loving the neighbor, are to be valued when it comes to our salvation and not indulgences. This is, of course, very consistent with the Roman Catholic theology in which Luther had been raised, which taught we are justified by faith, which is formed by love. This raises an important point. It appears Luther's theological insights concerning justification by faith alone are not fully developed when he writes the 95 Theses. Faith formed by love, a Roman Catholic teaching coming out of Thomas Aquinas, is what Luther believed at the time, not faith alone. Skipping ahead, we can see Luther sharpen his critique of the practice of selling indulgences. And it's clear that flowing out of the theological rationale is a sharp critique of the social implications. In Theses 62 through 66, Luther openly attacks the abuses evident in the indulgence practices, namely, using them as payment for the remission of sins for people who are dead. This is how Luther put it. "The true treasure of the church is the most holy gospel of the glory and grace of God, but this treasure is naturally most odious, for it makes the first to be last. On the other hand, the treasure of indulgences is naturally most acceptable, for it makes the last to be first. Therefore, the treasures of the gospel are nets with which one formerly fished for men of wealth. The treasure of indulgences are nets with which one now fishes for the wealth of men." In this handful of statements, you get a good sense of Luther's capacity for logic and his sharp sense of using words and wordplay as a weapon to make his point. This is a hallmark of all of Luther's polemical writings. Now, to be sure, Luther's sharp pen and sharp tongue are not appreciated by all. Some would have preferred Luther using a more conciliatory tone. But any serious student of Luther will readily recognize that when Luther gets his ire up, it's because the gospel is at stake and the ability to care for souls needs to be defended.